I came back from a business trip. My fiancée froze as her sister ran up and hugged me, and for 1 second, before anyone said a word, I forgot how to breathe. It was almost midnight. I dragged my suitcase over the threshold, still soaked from the storm. The smell of wet asphalt and salt on my coat. The house glowed warm behind me, and outside the street ran with rain. I hadn't even called out a name when a shape in a floral dress rushed out of the shadows and threw her arms around me. Her eyes were shut. Her shoulders were shaking. Down the hall, in a champagne silk gown, my fiancée stood perfectly still, her hands hanging at her sides. My name is Elliot Shaw. I'm 34, and I put old buildings back together for a living. That's the honest way to say it. The fancy word is restoration architect, but what I actually do is stand in rooms that have been standing for 100 years and figure out how to keep them standing for 100 more. Charleston is full of them. Old plaster, heart pine floors, staircases that have carried 6 generations of feet. Most people walk past those houses and see something pretty. I walk past them and see everything that's holding them up and everything that's about to give. I got divorced at 27. Lauren and I never had children, and when it ended, there wasn't much to divide except the quiet. She's a good person. We just wore each other down slow, the way water wears down stone, until one morning there was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said too many times. After that, I did what I knew how to do. I disappeared into the work. A leaking roof doesn't ask you how you're feeling. A rotted beam doesn't need you to be whole. You just show up, and you fix what's broken. And for a few hours, you forget that something in you is broken too. For a lot of years, that was the whole shape of my life. Work, and the quiet after work, and the road between the two. I told myself I liked it that way. A man can tell himself almost anything if he says it often enough and keeps his hands busy while he says it. There was one thing I carried on every job. A small brass compass, worn smooth at the edges, with a faint engraving on the inside of the lid that read St. Helena, 614. For 6 years I assumed it was some old man's mark, a survey line, a date that meant something to somebody who wasn't me. It sat in my coat pocket on every drive to every site. I told myself it was habit. I didn't let myself think about where it came from. Then there was Marissa. Marissa filled a room the way light fills it. You noticed her before you noticed anything else. She worked in luxury event public relations, which is a long way of saying she made rich people feel like the most important guests at their own parties, and she was very good at it. When she laughed on the front porch, the whole street heard it. When she walked into a gala, heads turned before she'd said a word. I think, back then, I confused all that brightness for warmth. A man who has been alone for a long time will do that. He'll mistake the loudest thing in the room for the truest. She had opinions about me, too. About the flannel I wore to job sites, about the truck I refused to trade in, about the compass most of all. Why do you keep carrying that old junk, she'd say, plucking it off the counter and dropping it back down like it embarrassed her. I never had a good answer. I'd just pick it up again and put it back in my pocket where it belonged. And then, a few weeks before all of this, her younger sister moved in. Her name was Hazel. She was 28, and she'd come to Charleston to restore the historic gardens of an old estate downtown, the kind of work that takes a whole season and a very particular kind of patience. Their mother had asked her to help with the wedding while she was in town, and her lease hadn't started yet, so she took the guest room at the end of the hall. That was the arrangement. That was all any of us said out loud about it. Hazel was the opposite of her sister. Where Marissa filled a room, Hazel changed its temperature. You didn't notice her the way you noticed Marissa. You noticed, instead, that the room had gotten gentler, softer at the edges, and only later did you realize it was because she was standing quietly in the corner of it. She didn't reach for attention. If anything, she folded herself smaller so there'd be more room for everyone else. I didn't understand, back then, why I found it so easy to breathe when she was in the house. I understand now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the weeks before the storm. Hazel had been in the house for maybe 10 days before I noticed the small things, and the small things were everything. She learned how I took my coffee without ever asking. Black, no sugar, in the chipped mug I'd had since before the divorce, the one Marissa kept trying to throw out. One morning I came downstairs and it was already sitting by the window, still steaming, exactly the way I liked it. I stood there, holding it for a long moment, not sure what to do with the fact that a near stranger had gotten something right that my own fiancé never bothered to learn. Then there was the hinge. The back screen door had a hinge that had been groaning for a month. I'd complained about it, meant to fix it, never found the time. One evening I went to step outside and the door swung shut behind me without a sound. She'd oiled it. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't asked me to notice, hadn't collected the credit. It just worked now, quietly, the way things do when someone cares enough to fix them and is humble enough not to announce it. And the garden. God. The garden. When Hazel arrived, the courtyard behind the house was a lost cause, choked with weeds. The old bed's gone to ruin. I'd stopped looking at it. Within 2 weeks, she had it breathing again. She'd be out there at first light in a wide straw hat, kneeling in the dirt, her hands moving through the soil like they were reading it. Gardenias came back first, and their smell drifted through the whole downstairs, sweet and heavy, so that even inside the house, I always knew where she was. I started finding excuses to be near it. I'd take my coffee out to the back steps in the mornings and pretend I was reviewing drawings when really I was just watching her work. There was a peace in it I hadn't felt in years. She never made me talk. She'd just glance up, nod, and go back to the beds. And somehow that silence was better company than most of the conversations I'd had in a decade. One evening she told me about the first garden she ever brought back, a ruined rose bed behind a church her grandfather had loved, how she'd been 16 and furious at the world, and how the work had been the only thing that ever quieted her. She talked about soil the way I talked about beams, like it was a living thing with a memory, like it could be wounded and could heal. I could have listened to her all night, and I remember thinking, with a small cold jolt of guilt, that I couldn't recall the last time I'd wanted to listen to Marissa at all. It was the way she understood my work that undid me, though. Marissa thought of what I did as a hobby that happened to pay. She'd nod when I talked about a project and check her phone somewhere around the second sentence. But Hazel asked the right questions. She wanted to know why I saved the original glass instead of replacing it, why I fought the owners to keep a crooked wall that a modern builder would have torn out in an afternoon. Because the crooked part is the honest part, I told her once, and she looked at me like I'd said something she'd been waiting years to hear. "That's exactly it," she said softly. "You don't fix a thing by erasing where it's been." I remember standing in the kitchen after that, holding a dish towel, feeling like the floor had shifted an inch under my feet. I want to be clear about something, because I've had a lot of time to be honest with myself since. I was an engaged man. I had no business feeling the floor move for anyone, and I told myself, firmly, that this was nothing, that a person is allowed to enjoy the company of a good listener, that I was reading a whole story into a woman being kind to a house she was a guest in. I told myself that a lot in those weeks. I was wrong about almost every part of it. There was something else too, a feeling I couldn't place. Every so often, in a certain light, Hazel would turn her head a particular way or laugh at something under her breath, and I'd get this jolt of recognition, sharp and sourceless, like a word on the tip of your tongue that won't come. I'd catch myself staring. Once she caught me at it and held my gaze a second too long. And something passed over her face, something that looked almost like fear, before she looked away. "Have we met?" I asked her one afternoon. I'd asked it before, somewhere, a long time ago. I can't shake the feeling. She was watering the ferns on the porch. She didn't turn around right away. "People say I have that kind of face," she said finally, and there was something careful in her voice, something held. Then she smiled and changed the subject. And I let her, because I was a man who'd learned not to push on doors that people wanted kept shut. Here's the thing I know now that I didn't know then. Anyone watching us from the outside would have seen it in a single afternoon. It was written all over her, in the coffee and the hinge, and the way she looked at that compass. She wasn't hiding it well. She was just hiding it from the one person too tangled up in his own life to read it. That's the cruel arithmetic of it. Everybody in that house could see what was happening to me. Except me. I want you to understand that Hazel never did a single thing to earn her sister's suspicion. She didn't flirt. She didn't linger. If anything, she was more careful with me than she was with anyone. Keeping a hand's width of distance, she never let close, laughing a beat too late, leaving the room whenever the two of us had been alone in it too long. She was doing everything a decent person could do to smother a fire she'd never asked to feel. And still it showed, the way a fire shows through a shut door, in the heat coming off the wood. The compass caught her attention more than once. I'd set it on the counter while I washed up, and I'd look over to find her looking at it, her whole face gone still, and open in a way I didn't have a word for. "You still carry it," she said one evening. Not a question. A statement. Low. Almost to herself, I looked at her. "You say that, like you'd know." Her hand hovered over it for a second, then drew back. "It just looks like something that mattered to someone," she said. And she turned away toward the sink. And I watched her shoulders and thought, not for the first time, that she carried some private grief around, like a stone in her pocket, the same way I carried mine. The tension in the house was quieter, but it was there. Marissa noticed the coffee. She noticed the hinge, the garden, the way conversation between Hazel and me had a rhythm to it that hers and mine had lost somewhere along the way. She never said anything outright. It came out sideways, in little cuts. "Aren't you helpful?" she'd say to Hazel, smiling with her mouth and not her eyes. "You've always been so good at making yourself useful." And Hazel would just lower her head and step back. Always a step back. She never once claimed a single inch of space in that house, never once let a moment tip toward her, even when I could feel it wanting to. At the time, I thought she was shy. I thought she was just deferring to her older sister the way younger siblings sometimes do. I didn't understand that she was protecting something. That every step backward was costing her more than I could have guessed. That she'd made a decision, before she ever walked through our door, to want nothing, ask for nothing, and disappear when it was over. She'd built her whole visit around leaving no mark. It's the loneliest kind of love, the kind that plans its own exit before it ever says hello. I only understood all of that later. After the storm. After the door, the project in Savannah was supposed to take 2 weeks. An old cotton warehouse on the river, a beautiful ruin of a building that a developer wanted saved. I kissed Marissa goodbye, put the compass in my coat, and drove 3 hours south into work I could lose myself in. For 12 days it went the way these things go. Then the storm came up the coast faster than anyone predicted. The site flooded. The cell towers on that stretch went down, and for the better part of a day I was simply gone. No signal, no way to call, hauling tarps over exposed timber in the rain, with a crew of men who couldn't reach their families either. I didn't think much about how it looked from the outside. I was just doing the work, the way I always did. The way I'd taught myself to when doing the work was the only thing that kept the quiet from swallowing me. I found out later what that day had been like in the house. That Marissa had spent it annoyed, mostly, because the storm was going to complicate an event she'd been planning for months. And here I was, making everything harder by not answering my phone, and that Hazel had spent it at the window. Not eating, not sitting, watching the road. Their mother told me that part, much later, and the way she told it made my chest ache. One sister worried about a canceled party. The other worried I was dead in a ditch on Highway 17. When I finally got clear of it and drove home, it was almost midnight, and I was running on nothing. I let myself in. The house was warm and lit and smelled of polish and rain, and before I could say a word, a shape in a floral dress came out of the shadows and wrapped both arms around me and held on like she was making sure I was real. Her eyes were shut. Her whole body was trembling. "You're okay," she whispered, so quiet I almost missed it. "You're okay. You're okay." And down the hall, in her champagne silk, dressed for an event she'd been about to leave for without me, Marissa stood frozen, her hands at her sides, watching her little sister hold the man she was supposed to marry. For a second, nobody moved. Then Hazel felt it too, and she stepped back like she'd touched a stove, her face going white. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry. We didn't hear from you, and she couldn't finish it." "It's fine," I said, though nothing about that room was fine. The next morning I reached for the compass, and it wasn't in my coat. I turned that house over. I emptied the suitcase twice, went through the truck, retraced every step. I don't think I'd panicked like that since the divorce. Marissa watched me tear the place apart over what she called a piece of scrap metal and told me I was being ridiculous. And maybe I was, but that compass was the only thing I owned that felt like a direction, and I couldn't have explained to her why losing it felt like losing a limb, because I didn't understand it myself. I know how that sounds. A grown man undone by a trinket. But some objects stop being objects. They become the one fixed point you steer by, and you don't notice how much you've been leaning on them until the day they're gone, and you find you can't stand up straight. It was Hazel who found me on the back steps at dusk, hunched over, useless. She sat down beside me and opened her hand. The compass lay in her palm, and it was different. The needle, which had been sticking for a year, drifting lazy and unreliable, now swung clean and sure and settled north like it had somewhere to be. "The pivot was gummed up," she said. "It just needed cleaning. I didn't think you'd mind." I stared at it. Then I stared at her. "How did you know how to fix this?" She hesitated a beat too long. "My grandfather had one like it," she said. "I grew up around them." And she pressed it into my hand and closed my fingers over it, and stood before I could ask anything else. That night we all had dinner with their mother, Corinne, who'd driven in for the weekend. It was a pleasant enough evening until it wasn't. Corinne was telling stories the way mothers do, warm and rambling, reaching back through the years, and somewhere between the salad and the second glass of wine she landed on one that stopped my fork halfway to my mouth. "Oh, you should have seen Hazel at 22, Corinne laughed. "She spent a whole summer down in Beaufort working on some little chapel, and she came home absolutely glowing about the architect down there. Wouldn't stop talking about him. The one she gave Grandpa Silas's compass to, remember? Her grandfather's compass, and she just handed it to some man she'd known 3 weeks. She shook her head fondly. First love, I suppose. She was never quite the same after that summer. The table went very quiet. I set my fork down. I could feel the blood leaving my face. Beaufort, a chapel, a compass, Grandpa Silas. St. Helena Island, where that chapel stood. 6:14, June 14th. I turned and looked at Hazel, and she was already looking at me, and her eyes were full, and everything I'd been unable to place for 3 weeks slammed into focus all at once. The girl in the straw hat by the chapel garden. The girl who'd pressed a brass compass into my hands on the last day and told me a compass doesn't tell you where to go, it tells you the way home. I hadn't forgotten her. I just never let myself believe she could be standing in my kitchen. "Hazel," I started, but that was when Marissa spoke, and her voice had gone somewhere cold and bright and terrible. She'd left the table. I hadn't noticed her go. Now she came back into the dining room holding a small, weathered field journal, the corners soft with age, and she dropped it open on the table in front of me. The pages were full of a young woman's handwriting and pressed plants gone brittle and brown. She turned it to a page near the front. Pressed there, flat and fragile, was a gardenia the color of old paper, and beside it, in careful ink, a date, June the 14th, and under the date, a few private lines I will not repeat here, because they were never written for me to read out loud. "Read the date, Elliot," Marissa said. Her hand was shaking. "Go on. Read it. She's been in love with you for 6 years. She didn't come here for a garden. She came here for you." Hazel had gone white as the tablecloth. "Marissa, don't what?" Marissa laughed. And it wasn't the laugh the whole street used to hear. This one had nothing warm in it. "Don't tell the truth? You've been circling him since the day you got here. The coffee, the door, the garden. Don't think I didn't see it. My own sister, in my own house, waiting for me to look away. The candles guttered. Somewhere, the rain had started again, ticking against the windows. I sat there with that brittle gardenia 6 inches from my hand and felt the whole shape of the last 6 years rearranging itself into something I hadn't understood at all. Hazel stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "It wasn't like that," she said, and her voice broke clean in half. "I never wanted anything. I was going to leave and never say a word. That was the whole plan, Marissa. The entire plan was to keep quiet and let you have your life." She was crying now, openly, the way she'd never once allowed herself to in all those careful weeks. "I gave him that compass when I was 22 years old, and I have loved him every single day since, and I have never, not once, tried to take him from you." The room rang with it, and then Marissa said the thing that ended everything. She was too far gone to stop herself. "Oh, spare me," she snapped. "You never stopped talking about your precious architect. For years. Beaufort this, the chapel that. Did you really think I didn't remember his name? Did you really think it was an accident?" The silence after that was total. I heard myself say, very quietly, "What did you just say?" Marissa's face flickered. For the first time all night, she looked afraid of her own mouth. "Elliot, you knew." I stood up. My legs didn't feel like mine. "When we met at the gala 2 years ago, you already knew who I was. You knew I was the man your sister loved. It wasn't a question anymore." Every strange, easy thing about how Marissa had come into my life was turning over to show its underside. How fast it had moved. How certain she'd been. "You didn't fall in love with me. You went and won me. Like a game. Like something of hers you could take." That is not she started. And stopped. Because it was. And everyone at that table could see it was. I've asked myself, since, why that landed as hard as it did. And I think it's because it explained everything I'd never had the courage to question. Why the whole thing had felt like a performance I'd been cast in rather than a life I'd chosen. Why I'd never once, in 2 years, felt truly known. You can't be known by someone who only ever wanted the winning of you. That's not love. That's acquisition, wearing love's clothes. I looked at the compass in my hand. The needle held north, clean and sure, the way it hadn't in a year, because Hazel had quietly fixed it and asked for no credit. The way she'd quietly fixed everything and asked for no credit, and I understood, finally, that the woman I'd been about to marry had never once shown me anything true, and the woman crying across the table from me had never once shown me anything false. I'd like to say I felt triumphant, or vindicated, or even angry. I didn't. Mostly I felt tired, and sad, and strangely clear. The way you feel when a fever finally breaks. 2 years of my life had just been revealed as somebody else's competition, and the thing I noticed was not the size of the lie but how little it had ever really touched me. You can't grieve a thing that was never real. What I grieved, standing there, was all the ordinary time I'd wasted not looking at the woman who'd been right in front of me, getting my coffee right, oiling my doors, loving me in the only language she'd let herself speak. "Elliot," Marissa said, "look at me. After everything you're going to throw us away over one dinner? Over a 6-year-old crush?" "No," I said, and I was surprised by how steady it came out. "I'm not throwing anything away. There was nothing here to throw. You didn't build this with me. You built it to beat her." I set the ring on the table beside the gardenia. "I can't marry you. I'm not even sure I ever met the real you." She stared at me. Then something in her went hard and final, and she stood, and I heard the wheels of her suitcase on the heart pine floor before I even saw her pack it, that small sound rolling toward the door and out of my life. The rain kept tapping the glass. Hazel was already moving for the hall, wiping her face, gathering her keys, doing the thing she'd promised herself she'd do, which was to vanish before she cost anyone anything more. "I should go," she was saying. "I never should have. This is my fault. All of it. I'll get a hotel. Hazel." I didn't reach for her. I wanted to. Every part of me wanted to close that distance and be done with it. But I just watched one sister get treated like a prize, and I would sooner cut off my own hand than do a version of that to the other one. So I kept my arms at my sides and I gave her the only thing I had, which was the truth, spoken plainly, across a room. "You gave me the way home 6 years ago," I said. I read the compass wrong. For a long time." She stopped in the doorway. "I'm not going to do this the fast way," I told her. "Not tonight. Not while it can still hurt you. You've spent 6 years being careful with me. Let me be careful with you." My voice was not entirely steady now. "Don't leave thinking you did something wrong. You're the only one in this house who never did." She turned around. Her keys were still in her hand. She looked at me for a long moment. This woman who had loved me quietly through a marriage, a divorce, 6 years of silence, and a summer of holding a stove-hot secret one careful step back at a time. "Okay," she whispered, and she put the keys down. Marissa left that autumn and didn't look back. The story of what happened moved through her circles the way those stories do, and the version that survived was not kind to her. And I won't pretend I lost sleep over it. She traded on the appearance of things for a living, and in the end the appearance of things turned on her. I heard she moved to Atlanta. We never spoke again. Some doors you're allowed to just let close. I didn't rush Hazel. That mattered to me more than I can explain. She'd finished the estate garden by October, and instead of leaving Charleston, she took a permanent post restoring historic landscapes up and down the Lowcountry, and I told myself that was reason enough to see her now and then. So we saw each other now and then. Carefully, slowly, a coffee here, a walk there, neither of us naming the thing that was so obviously growing between us, because we'd both learned the hard way that some things are ruined by being named too soon. That autumn passed, then winter, then it was June again. I'd like to tell you there was some grand moment where it all turned, but that's not how it went, and I think that's the point. It turned in small things, the same small things it had always lived in. It turned over 100 cups of black coffee, no sugar, in the chipped mug she never once suggested I throw away. It turned in a garden, where I started showing up at first light just to kneel in the dirt beside her and hand her tools she didn't need help holding. It turned on a job site, an old church we ended up restoring together, her bringing the grounds back to life, while I brought the walls back true, the two of us working the same building from the outside in, until we met somewhere in the middle. That church became a kind of language for us. She'd find me on the scaffold at the end of a long day and just stand at the bottom of it, not saying anything, until I climbed down. I'd find her in the churchyard, sleeves pushed up, dirt to the elbows, coaxing something green out of ground everyone else had given up on. We were both in the business of saving things other people had written off. It took me most of a year to realize we'd been doing the same work our whole lives, just in different materials, and that maybe that was the truest thing anyone could know about another person. I proposed nothing for a long time. I didn't want a single moment of what we built to carry the shape of what came before. So we let it be slow on purpose. We let it be ordinary, even, in the good way, the way a Sunday is ordinary. We cooked. We argued gently about paint colors and lost causes. We learned the unglamorous truth of each other, the moods and the long silences, the way you only ever learn a person when there's no audience left to perform for. And every plain day of it was worth more than the 2 glittering years I'd spent being won like a trophy. There was a night, early on, when we both got quiet at the same time, and I could see the question sitting on her face. Whether it was allowed, whether a thing that had started, once, in the tangle of her sister's life could ever come out clean on the other side. "People are going to have opinions," she said. "About us. About her. Let them," I said. I spent 34 years worried about how things looked from the outside. Your sister taught me exactly what that gets you. I took her hand across the table, the first time I'd let myself, and she didn't pull away. I don't want the version of my life that photographs well. I want the one that's true. That's you. It's been you the whole time. I was just too busy listening to the loudest voice in the room to hear it. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 6 years. That was the closest we came, for months, to saying it out loud. And we didn't need much more than that. When 2 people have already waited that long, a held breath finally let go says more than any speech ever could. I stopped worrying, somewhere in there, about what anyone would call it. I'd spent my whole life shoring up things the world had already given up on, and the last thing I meant to give up on was the one person who'd quietly done the same for me. On the 14th of June, I drove her south, 3 hours down to St. Helena Island, and I didn't tell her where we were going. She figured it out when the road narrowed and the live oaks closed over us and the little chapel came up out of the green exactly the way it had the summer we met. The garden she'd planted at 22 had gone wild, and then been tamed by other hands, but the bones of it were hers, still, if you knew how to look. Gardenias climbed the doorframe she'd once knelt beside. Their smell hit me before I'd even opened the truck door, and I was 28 again for a second, hollowed out by a divorce, standing in a churchyard, while a girl in a straw hat pressed something into my hands. I took the compass out of my pocket. I opened the lid, and I turned it so she could read the faint engraving inside, the one I'd carried against my heart all those years and never once understood. St. Helena. 6:14, I read aloud. I thought it was your grandfather's mark. For years I thought it was some survey line, some old man's coordinate. I never once did the simple math. Her eyes filled. It was the day I met you, she said. I engraved it that night, in my room at the inn, with a needle and a steady hand, and absolutely no idea what I was doing. I was terrified you'd figure it out. She laughed, wet and small, and then I was terrified you never would. I did, I said. I'm slow. But I did. The chapel bell moved a little in the wind. The needle in my palm held north, clean and true, because she'd fixed that too, a year ago, and asked for nothing. You told me a compass doesn't tell you where to go. It tells you the way home. I didn't know what you meant. I know now. I closed her hands around it the way she'd once closed mine. It was always pointing here. It was always pointing at you. There was no crowd, no music, just a bell, and the gardenias and the two of us in a churchyard in the June light, finally standing in the same place at the same time, 6 years late, and not a minute too late at all. I'm telling you all of this from the other side of it, now that I know how the story goes. For 6 years I carried a compass and thought it was pointing me forward, into the next job, the next city, the next thing that would keep me too busy to feel how alone I was. It wasn't pointing forward at all. It was pointing back. To a girl in a straw hat. To the one person who'd been standing quietly at the door of my life the whole time, asking for nothing, fixing what was broken, waiting for me to look the right direction. I've thought a lot about how close I came to missing it. A different night, a different phone signal, a mother who never told that one story over dinner, and I'd have married the noise and spent the rest of my life mistaking it for music. That's the part that still keeps me up sometimes, not what I lost. What I almost never found. I almost married the loudest voice in the house. And I nearly walked right past the one who'd been quietly pointing me home for 6 years. So, let me leave you with the 2 questions I've had to sit with. Have you ever chased the person who filled the room and missed the one who quietly made it warmer? And if you'd been me, standing in that churchyard with the whole truth finally in your hands, would you have gone back to the chapel? If Hazel's quiet kind of love hit you somewhere real, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me down in the comments, was it the compass, or was it her, that finally brought me home?